Hello, everyone. I'm going to apologize for a couple of things off the bat. I am feeling sick, so I might sniffle a little bit. And the others would be just that my equipment isn't great, so I hope that the video slash sound is okay, but it might be just kind of serviceable instead. And the other is that I'll be looking up at my computer, and that you might hear my entire family upstairs from time to time, just because they have to be here and I can't go anywhere else. So I'm not gonna stop if there's any interruptions. I'm just gonna kind of soldier through. So this presentation is for RIP, the Remix Manifesto. And I'm just gonna start on the first slide here, and I feel like I should be doing the Disney turn the page, but for this first kind of title page, I just set out the 4 points of the Remix Manifesto. So it's not, I wouldn't say that the manifesto is the thesis of the work, but it does serve as the structure for the film in a lot of ways. So just as a reminder, so the points are: culture always built on the past always tries to control the future is becoming less free, and to build free societies, you must limit the control of the past. So onto the second slide. My one sentence summary of the documentary is: director and writer Brett Gaylor explores the history and philosophical impact of copyright law in the Western world and abroad, specifically through the lens of music creation via artist Girl Talk and through the practical creation of the documentary itself. In my approximation, his thesis, or the general argument being made by the piece, is that copyright law limits human creativity and creative freedom. So this is the next slide is the kind of introduction to Brett Gaylor as a person. So he is Canadian. He's from BC, and a fairly maybe mid-career filmmaker, but for somebody who's fairly mid-career, he's established a lot of kind of entities or groups. So one of those being I Steal Film, documentary production company, as well as the Open Source Cinema Project, which was the online platform he designed in order to share all the footage for Remix Manifesto, where other people could access the footage and then change it however they wanted. So I also have a list of some of his film credits. The first one being in 2004, and he wasn't the director or the writer of this project, but he was facilitating a film project for NFB called I Am Inuk, I Am Alive, which is a project that gave film training and film equipment to high school seniors who were Inuk up north, and he was a part of that project in 2004 for the NFB. And then 2008 was his first film as the director, which was RIP, which is what we're talking about. And then in 2015 we have Do Not Track, and in 2018 we have OK Google, which was an exploration of his child's life through Google searches. So in this film, it's pretty antagonistically pitting what he defines as the past versus the future. And obviously, as any good debater feels, his ideal is the future. So he defines kind of the forces of the past as ownership of ideas versus sharing ideas, profit as being the main objective, corporations as being controlling entities, and then citizens being defined primarily as consumers. And then the future that he sees includes Creative Commons, so the sharing of projects and information, whether it be of one's own work or other works, use of the public domain beyond what it has been lately, and collaborators and creators, people defined as by their ability to create instead of just consume. So I did pull out a handful of quotes that I felt kind of just defined some of the general attitudes of the film well. But I think I'm just going to read two of them that I think are most important. Brett himself says in the film, my point is that copyright is out of control. It's been manipulated for profit at everyone's expense. And so in this case, he's talking about, the historical use of copyright law versus what it is now, which is an entity to primarily benefit corporations versus creators. And then I also chose a quote by Girl Talk, which just says, it's beneficial to share ideas. So you have this whole ethos that is, that we're all collectively better when we share our ideas instead of kind of trying to hoard them in a way. So obviously the point of this presentation was for me to not just talk about the film itself, but to also talk about how it's relevant to visual art specifically, because I feel like visual art is a bit of its own animal. It's a little bit different. It has some different concerns. The first thing I did was I tried to come up with a definition of remix that was kind of general enough that it could be applied to visual art. And so the definition I came up with was the using other works as raw materials to create something new. So using that definition, a handful of art movements that would fit into that would be Dadaism, where a lot of artists used a lot of found objects to make art. Surrealism, which used kind of popular materials and anything kind of existing in the world already, using the filter of a subconscious mind. So, if you're dreaming about cans of soup or whatever, then you're justified in showing it in your painting. So surrealism did a lot of that. Pop art is even more blatant. A lot of pop art was based on the reproduction of popular culture, objects and people and culture, movies. Prime example would be Andy Warhol, who we'll talk about later, but a Campbell's soup can existed and all he did was make a print of it. So you have this direct reproduction that's happening. Slightly more modern, well, maybe not, but example would be street art. Banksy is a really good example, although he's just kind of one of the most well-known, but and it's kind of an interesting example because street art is within itself inherently illegal generally, and so you don't have that same fear of copyright law as other artists might have, because most street artists kind of thrive on anonymity as a part of their practice because their practice is illegal. And then we also have what's called appropriation art, which I'll talk about a little bit more extensively here. So appropriation art is defined as the use of pre-existing objects or images with little or no alterations to them. So you could think about that in terms of like the Duchamp urinal, whether or not it's a Duchamp urinal is under debate, but just for the sake of this, so you're talking about an artist who found or purchased an existing object, wrote a name on it and put it in a gallery, and then was trying to make the argument that that was enough to make it a unique piece of art. So appropriation art is kind of defined as that, those kinds of activities where almost no kind of original creation is taking place. It's just kind of the use of other images or objects, which one might not think is a terribly appealing or attractive mode of art making, But if we go to the next slide, you see a pretty extensive list, which I would imagine couldn't possibly include everybody who has made appropriation art, but only those who have openly said that they do, or those who have been kind of posthumously labeled as such. And there's some pretty big names in there. Jeff Koons, Barbara Kruger, Banksy, Damien Hirst. Like, there's a lot of big names. So I wanted to go through a handful of copyright legal cases that involved artists, just as kind of an exercise to see how it applies. So my first example is Andy Warhol versus Patricia Caulfield. So Andy Warhol's print Flowers was based off of a photocopy from a magazine. The original photograph was taken by Patricia Caulfield and shown in a magazine called Modern Photography. And Andy Warhol literally clipped the picture out of the magazine and then made a few photocopies and kind of adjusted black and white and then put his own color on it. So Patricia Caulfield won her case against Andy Warhol and had to be was paid out. It was settled out of court, and Andy Warhol had to pay some royalties as well. I tried really hard to find like a monetary value of that because I wanted to know what she actually made off of that case, because I could find the most recent selling price of one of these prints, which was $1,322,500, and I wanted to know if she made anywhere near that amount from her court case as an exercise, but I couldn't find it. The next one I looked at was Jeff Koons. So Jeff Koons calls himself an appropriation artist, and he's been sued many, many times, and he also makes a lot of money. So but I chose one in particular. And so in this case, he was also sued by a photographer who took a picture called Puppies. And then the way he kind of got a hold of the images, he bought a postcard that had the photograph on it at like a convenience store. And then made, his assistants made a sculpture from it. So Jeff Koons tried to use the defense that his copy was a parody and therefore an original work, which is kind of like satire law. If you're making fun of something or someone, you're supposed to be able to reference it. It's kind of a form of fair use in a way. But he didn't successfully use that defense. So the show that he put up that first displayed this sculpture ended up making Jeff Koons over $6 million. And the sculptures themselves, there was 3 of them. They each sold for $375,000. And the interesting thing here to note about the legal case is that it took decades to be resolved. Copyright cases aren't always the highest profile to get pushed through, so a practical part of it is that sometimes they take some time. So all of these works had been purchased, were in collections for years before the court case ever was closed. But the photographer, Art Rogers, ended up winning, and then the result of that was that the collectors, the people who owned the pieces, had them seized, and they were given to Art Rogers, who then packed them up in boxes and hid them in a warehouse. So sometimes it's interesting to think about the practical, like what actually happens to an art piece if it's found to be somebody else's intellectual property. And in this case, they weren't necessarily destroyed, but they will never be seen again, and that's kind of a bitter. I don't know. I still don't know how I feel about that, but. And then the next case, which is interesting in a different way, I tried to choose things that were pretty different from each other. Sherry Levine versus the estate of Walker Evans. So Walker Evans was also a photographer and a fairly famous photographer. And then Sherry Levine took pictures of his photographs that are indistinguishable from the originals, at least to the naked eye. And then she displayed them in a show as a group of works called After Walker Evans. So she obviously wasn't trying to get away with anybody thinking that they were hers. She directly referenced the artist in the title of her work. So, and he's also a very famous photographer. So it's not a surprise that his estate launched a complaint against her. And then in her response was that she just gave them all the work. She donated it to his estate. And I would say that it's from that action, it seems like she probably expected this to happen. But then the really interesting part is that his estate then donated them to the Met Museum, who then displayed them and have displayed them as part of their permanent collection under her name as an artist. So I'm not sure, like, why. I'm not sure why the estate kind of took it to court or made a complaint if they then didn't have a problem with her getting credit. It's kind of a strange case. And she said, among other things, she said her goal was to create work that had like a cultural value, you know, it's something that people recognize and know, but then has no economic value. So it's like she's getting people to look at Walker Evans's work by making them look at her work, but simultaneously her work has no value because of that. This is just a reproduction. Anyway, it's an interesting idea. And then the final one isn't a legal case at all. It's more an example of what I think remix can look like in visual arts. So the Chapman brothers purchased prints, original prints by Francisco de Goya, the Disasters of War, which is a very famous set of intaglio prints. And then they drew on them, which made a lot of people very upset. But they're not super uncommon prints. There were large editions. There's a lot of them out there. They're probably still not cheap because they're historical pieces, but legally they did nothing wrong because they purchased the property, or they purchased the artwork, and it was their property, which they then chose to deface. So whether you think that's a new work or just a destruction of somebody else's work, it's kind of up to you. But it's an interesting use of that kind of idea of using other people's art as the raw material for your own. So it's kind of difficult to create a precedent for this, but I wanted to talk about, you know, as soon as I watched the documentary and was thinking about it, I kind of remembered a whole chapter of my life, which was the first couple of years I was in art school. It's the same year that this film came out. And I watched it in more than one class, I think. I was in some new media courses early on in my art school career, and a lot of my professors were really, really into this documentary. And so I wanted to talk about some of the kind of storytelling almost type experience that I had with this film early on. It's a bit of a flashback to watch it again, but I have a quote here from one of my professors, Derek Bellia, he's an English professor. He teaches graphic narrative at the University of Arts. But I feel like it summarizes some of the ideas nicely. But he says, don't protect your artwork, give it away, trust your audience, be your own pirate. For every space you occupy, create two, publish other people, give your work away, post your work online for free, embrace the unexpected, make PDFs of your work, post it online, encourage circulation over restriction, give it away. Generosity is always sustainable. So it's a little radical, but I feel like it was a nice summary of some of these ideas, but in more of a fine arts context. But kind of above and beyond that, I remember being actively discouraged from trying to enforce kind of, I mean, it's not copyright, but like accusing people of plagiarism when I was in art school. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit because it seems applicable. Also, there's this picture of me. So some of this I talked about in the class when we did the question period, so I'm not going to go over it extensively, but there was a couple of things that I didn't talk about. So very much early on in art school, a lot of people feel like their ideas are 100% original and theirs, and nobody's ever had them before. And they, at least in my experience in art school, I was discouraged from thinking that pretty early on and openly. And as soon as you take any kind of art history or contemporary practice course, that idea is trained out of you pretty quickly. And so part of the attitude is like, your ideas come from someone else too. So if you accuse somebody of ripping you off, you kind of open yourself up to being criticized for doing the same thing just to somebody else. But I think a big part of it is that it's not really worth the effort. It's kind of explained that it's like, it's really hard to prove that somebody's ripped you off. And it's not worth it. Like, if you're going to put all your energy into trying to prove that somebody took your idea, then you're not going to have enough energy to actually make more work and move on. And it'll probably come to nothing anyway. And so there's very much this attitude of like, well, if somebody ripped you off, then they suck, and why don't you just keep going and make more work and get better? But then there's also this idea that the art community is really small, and especially when you're in art school and you're all making art, and you're not used to having deadlines to come up with concepts, and you're all working in the same spaces and you're all working in the same classes, that it's inevitable that people are going to cross-pollinate. Things can get a little incestuous, and that's a natural thing that happens. And that often, if people end up making similar work, it's just kind of because you're in the same space and you're picking up on a lot of those similar ideas. And to kind of acknowledge that, like, your students and what you make at this moment might not be what you make forever, and that what you can end up making is actually enemies. And if you make enemies that early on, it can be really damaging. Art communities are small communities. So I'm not going to go through my questions, but I will just post them for posterity's sake, as it's part of the thing. But I think we kind of covered them already, and they may make more sense now that they're within the context of the rest of the presentation. But thank you for listening, and I'll see you all soon.